Hello and welcome to Talking Books. I'm Jill de Villiers. The pandemic has affected all of our lives in some measure or another between the early 2020 and today. My guest is future strategist, author and international speaker John Sanei, whose whole world came crashing down when all of his speaking engagements were cancelled due to COVID. In his latest book, he tells us how he got back on his feet and rebuilt his career. He also maps a path for us to reframe our thinking and survive and thrive. The book is Who Do We Become? Step boldly into our strange new world. Welcome, John.
Thank you so much.
Great to have you here.
Yes, great to be back in the studio.
Oh,
actually.
it's been a while as well.
Yes,
hey?
exactly.
So you have three main parts in your book, and I'd like to touch on each of them during this discussion. There's Anguish, there's Abnormal, and then there's Adventure.
That's right.
So let's start with the Anguish and what happened when your world fell apart.
Well, I think before I tell you that, I think we must realize that all transformations take on these three phases. They go from a space of anguish, sadness, leaving the familiar world and moving to strangeness or abnormal, which is the sort of new world that you don't quite understand. And eventually you get to an adventure, but we're not quite there as humanity. And I think the world's kind of stuck between anguish and abnormal at the moment. And so I wanted to share my experience through the book to show people that it's okay to have gone through a depression. It's okay to have lost so much that we'd worked for, because this is the process of actually transforming. And we are in the midst of this massive transformation. So for me personally, all my events got cancelled. I went from living in Dubai, traveling to Amsterdam, London and LA to Magubuskloof in Limpopo for 6 months. And there was a lot of time to think, and a lot of sadness came up.
And living with your parents, and how did that feel?
That's a touchy point. I write in the book how I always thought it was sad for men in their 40s to be living with their parents. And there I was, living with my parents on a farm with COVID happening around the world. Although I was incredibly grateful to be on a farm. Many people were stuck in unfortunate places. But still, there was a lot to deal with so much time on our hands and so much things to think about.
So what was it that concerned you most at that point?
Well, an incredible amount of uncertainty. We didn't know who was going to die, who was going to live. We didn't know if the world was going to come back at any time. We didn't know if it was a conspiracy theory or not. It just seemed like everything that we had once dreamed of, worked for, dissipated overnight. And we all had to deal with a whole lot of things that brought up personal trauma, work trauma, whatever the case may be for us.
And it's strange how things, when that happened, we actually stayed open at
That's
CNBC,
right. Yes.
but very, very small, just a very skeleton staff. And how I drove into the office with completely empty streets. And it feels as if we're almost back to normal at the moment. But we're not quite. Hey?
Well, I don't think there's normal anymore. And I think the normal we had wasn't even anything people really enjoyed. You know, who enjoyed going to work 45 minutes in the morning, 45 minutes in the afternoon, be so anxious about everything and not getting enough done and not having enough time in the day. I think this has recalibrated many things for many people. And we've reassessed many things. For me personally, relationships have become so very important, and kind of making up with people that I had little tiffs with, or just, making up and healing many parts of our lives. So I don't want to go back to normal. I want to create a new normal. And I think this is why this book was written.
And how did you cope then? What did you do to deal with your anguish and your pain?
Well, I went for runs in the forest and screamed a lot. Well, I was by myself a lot. And so I would, in this forested area where my parents live, and I would just go for runs and really try and release as much sort of frustration I had. And then I meditated and I wrote. So those were the three things that kept me busy. I was consistently writing and trying to express myself and trying to break through the sort of things that I had to work through inside my head. So a combination of exercise, screaming, meditation, and writing really helped me through.
And then you moved back to Cape Town and you started running. You did a marathon.
I did the Ironman.
Yep.
Yes, I did the Ironman because I didn't have time to train for something like that pre the COVID. And I thought, well, great opportunity for me to train for this sort of race. And what I really learned from the training was a redefinition of my relationship with pain. And this was very much part of this book, is that we have to redefine the discomfort that we're going through at the moment. We have no choice. It's happening anyway. But most people spend a lot of time complaining about the change, and not enough people are stepping up to evolve to a point to meet this future and what it needs from us. And so people are worried about the world not coming back to what it was. but they're not asking themselves, who do I need to become to meet this future? And that's why this book was written.
This is why this book is written.
Yes.
So you also write, if we move on to the abnormal section of your book, and you talk there about the saculum.
Yes.
With it's 4 different stages,
Yes.
and we are now in the 4th stage,
Yes,
where
that's right.
it's between 2008 and
2028.
2028. Just
That's
tell
right.
me a little bit about this
Sure.
whole thing and how we got to where we are now.
Sure. I was researching something or another over COVID, and I came across this book called The Fourth Turning, written in 1996 by 2 gentlemen called William Strauss and Neil Howe. You don't know who they are, but you've used their language hundreds of times in your life. They are the guys who introduced us to the generational archetypes. The baby boomers, Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, these were the guys who told us that there were different motivating factors for these generations. But they did further research, and in 1996 they wrote this book called The Fourth Turning. And in it they describe something that humanity is going through called the saculum, which is approximately an 80-year cycle, and humanity's been going through it for about 400 years, according to their research. And so when they wrote this book in 1996, it was a blimp. Nobody even gave it any attention, and it became a super bestseller in 2008. And what they said in the book is, we won't make any predictions for what's coming, but from our research, it looks like from 2008 to 2028, we will enter something called the crisis or the winter or the 4th season or turning of the saculum. And what we should experience is exactly what we did in the last 4th turning, which was 1926 to 1946, which was fascism, political divide, job losses, financial crisis, and war. And here we are, almost at the exact same characteristics as we had 80 years ago. And we get to realize that life is seasonal. And even though we're not aware of many of the seasons that are happening, these broad stroke seasons are important to understand, because if you're having a crisis of meaning, you're not alone, because it's every touch point of our lives that's been questioned. And this research gave me a lot of solace to say, oh, this is part of the process, and so I better get ready for the next cycle that should start in 2028.
Like in markets, we also talk about cycles going, and it will always recover. So you may go into a bad one, and then you'll recover, and things will go better.
Yes.
So according to this, we only have a few more years of suffering
Well,
left.
look, it's suffering, if you want to call it that. It's suffering, it's recalibration, if you want to approach it in a way that says, I understand that I need to reframe how I add value to the world. And I write this point around seeking discomfort in times of transition. And so it's not suffering if you approach it like I approached the Iron Man. You have to reframe your relationship with pain. And this is what we're going through. It's an emotional and mental pain that we're going through, because think about it. Education doesn't count for much anymore like it used to. And so that in itself is a huge pain point. What about the governmental structures that we don't like? The financial structures that keep us up at night? Religious factors that are changing all around the world? So all of this stuff is really part and parcel of the cycle. And so I see it as an opportunity for us to evolve rather than suffer.
So now, with economies being in crisis, we're looking at Sri Lanka, for example, at what they're going through now. How do you see more countries going through that sort of thing?
Well, you know, I often say this, that America and Europe built a financial system that benefits them. It seems like the rest of the world has to play catch up with these 2 giants. And in fact, China's been so upset about this, they keep playing games with the American dollar and wanting to not play with it. So we have to realize that the world is not structured in a fair way. And we are seeing many small economies falter. And why? Because it's built up against us. Plus, we have not so mature leadership as well in many countries around the world. And so if we think about El Salvador taking on the Bitcoin, and we start to see that so many other countries around the world aren't coping with the financial structures. And again, if we think about the 4th turning, what does it tell us? There has to be an implosion of financial structures. And remember, it was 1952 that Bretton Woods happens and the dollar became the global exchange, which was a brand new financial process that we started. That process is coming to an end, and it's time for us to think of a new one. And for me, it's the blockchain and Bitcoin.
So now we're entering the 3rd section of your book, the adventure.
Right.
And how do we turn this into an adventure?
So we got to realize that the skills that got us here are not going to be the skills that get us there. And so if we just take a zoom out picture and we realize that in agricultural times, our bodies, our muscles and our brawn were our biggest asset. And if we didn't have a healthy body, we couldn't toil the soil for 16 hours a day and feed our families and trade something at the market. But when the Industrial Revolution arrived, our bodies became replaced or were replaced by factories. And so all of a sudden our bodies weren't our biggest asset, and we had to go to school to learn something new called intelligence, knowledge, left brain thinking, analytical thinking. And we give people raises with higher IQs. We put them into Mensa because this was the skill that was so necessary. But as we evolve into the quantum phase, we realize that artificial intelligence, data, technology, and blockchain are reframing this power of intelligence and knowledge. And so if we are in a world that we compete against technology, we're not going to win. And so we have to evolve into a new skill. And the new skill I define as intuition. And many people might think that this is, intuition is for hippies. It's for people who wear sandals and eat lentils. It's not for me, John. But don't think about it for you. Think about it for your kids. Because you know that your kids are studying things at school that aren't going to be relevant over the next 10 years. The poor educational system doesn't know what else to do because nobody knows what it's going to look like in 10 or 15 years, right? But the only thing we will have is this ability to be unique. Because the currency of the future is based on our individualism. Whereas in the past, it was based on fitting into a system, a lawyer, a doctor, an engineer, a finance person. Tomorrow and the days ahead will become all about fitting out. So your individual currency will become the most important thing. And so intuition is made up of a few things. One, wisdom, healing our past, having memories with no trigger, so we have a true intuitive decision-making process. Two, making decisions based on curiosity, fascination, and excitement. Our kids come alive when they do these things. Never gifted at school, never celebrated at school. At school, it's about fitting in, not fitting out. The third thing is imagination. We have somehow switched off the power of imagination. In fact, to the point that UNESCO calls this megatrend a poverty in reimagination. Humanity suffering from an inability to imagine what's next because we're so keen to hold on to the familiar and the old. The fourth one is experimentation, and for us to really bring into life what we are imagining, thinking, and being curious about. And fifth is meditation, because it's only through meditation that we will be able to unlearn to relearn, to stop neurons firing and having new ones firing and wiring. So you really have to go through a process of re-engaging a brand new skill set for us, and this is what I break down in the last part of the book.
So be open to learning new things, to be resilient, to try things that you haven't done before.
Well, resilience has this connotation sometimes that you have to stick to what you've always been doing and push harder. I don't like that definition of resilience. I think we have to be imaginative, calm, collaborative, and to think about things in broad terms rather than narrow focus terms. And it really comes down to the level of anxiousness that we have in the society, is that people are in survival mode. And because they're in survival mode, they can't be creative. They can't think broadly. And so we have to almost change our brain waves to be able to see the bigger picture and to be able to become optimistic about change, optimistic about learning, and having the tool sets to do it.
John, it's been absolutely fantastic having you here. And I must say that I really enjoyed reading your book. It has a lot in it, it has a lot of meaning in it, and I will be recommending it to many people.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Thanks so much. And my guest, of course, is futurist John Sanei, and his latest book is Who Do We Become? Step Boldly into Our Strange New World. And thanks for watching. See you soon.